Hello, good morning folks, thank you for joining us. This is Prescott Community Church's online service. It is Sunday the 20th of December, that's right, Christmas in just 5 days! Yay! We're going to be hearing from James Glass, who is Elam's Regional Superintendent for the North of England, shortly. But before then, we're going to have a little song with our band. So why don't you stand up, guys? You may be in your living room, but we can still worship together.
Your family. Hi everyone, it's good to be with you through the medium of video today. I'd like to speak to you from Luke chapter 1. It's about the birth of John the Baptist. We're going through a very trying time at the moment as a nation. In fact, the whole world is going through a time of difficulty. Some of us are going through great personal difficulty, some of the challenges that we're facing because of lockdown, because of the pandemic. They are hugely difficult for us to manage, to navigate, and some of us are really feeling the pressure of that. And I know that churches and church leaders are feeling that pressure as well. This has been a very, very difficult year in many different ways. But I want to suggest to you today that God has a future, God has some plans, and those plans are going to become more evident when we're through this, when this is over. But I also want to share the thought with you, or ask you to consider and reflect on the thought that the future that God has planned for us is already beginning, or has already begun. Because the future that's in God's heart for you and me, for your church, for the church that I'm part of, and even for our nation, is something that begins before we can see it with the naked eye. In other words, the future that God has planned for us begins in darkness. The time that God was about to bring about in the nation of Israel, the time when Messiah would come, was a time that began before anyone could see it. God was going to bring his son, Jesus, into the world. And before that, he was going to bring John the Baptist into the world. But if you had been alive at this time, you wouldn't have realized any of that until about, 25, 30 years later, when John the Baptist began his public ministry. Because God began his work in darkness, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that God began to shape the future in hiddenness. If you read through the account that Luke gives us of John the Baptist's birth, you find that it was set against the backdrop of a time of, if you want to call it, darkness, or when it seemed as though God's ways and God's work was hidden in or to the nation of Israel. Verse 5 of Luke chapter 1 says, "In the time of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zachariah." In the time of Herod, king of Judea. The very mention of Herod, king of Judea, it reveals so much about the political situation of that time. The nation, God's people, were under occupation by the Romans. Their land had been invaded, and the Romans were the governing authorities. So Herod being king was a limited kind of kingship, because his political masters were actually in Rome. And then there was a whole question mark of whether Herod really should be the king or not. This was a time of political instability and political uncertainty. It was a time when there was darkness in the political realm. Spiritually, it wasn't a great time either in the life of the nation. There was this expectation that one day Messiah would come into the world. But in all honesty, there didn't seem to be any indication that that was going to happen soon. There were all sorts of thoughts, all sorts of aspirations, hopes that this one or that one would be Messiah. But nothing had ever been realized. Nothing had ever materialized. And of course, there was no prophetic voice for something like 400 years. It was only as God began to break into the life of Zachariah and Elizabeth, and then began to break into the life of the nation through John the Baptist, that there was any sense of a word from God that was restored to the nation. The prophetic voice had been silent for a long, long time. So this was a time of darkness, or at least of God working in hidden ways. And then, of course, there was the hiddenness or the darkness of Zachariah and Elizabeth's own situation. There was personal darkness because there was disappointment in their lives. Look at verse 7 of Luke chapter 1. It says that they were childless because Elizabeth was not able to conceive, and they were both very old. I don't know what age they were, but the indication that we have from this verse, verse 7, is that they were well on in life. They were well past that time in life when it would have been ideal to have children. And it appeared that medically that was now impossible. That wasn't going to happen. And I can imagine that for many years that they had hoped that one day Elizabeth would become pregnant and she would bring a child into the world, and that after one child would follow another. That was the hope, and I'm sure the expectation at some stage in their lives. But now they had reached this point in their life where it looked as though that wasn't going to happen. And I can imagine, though it's not revealed to us here, that there was an element of personal disappointment. To be childless in ancient culture was very, very different to being childless today. It was seen as something of shame. We don't see it in that way in our culture. We don't see it that way today. It's seen very, very differently. But through the lens of ancient culture, this was something that you may well have been embarrassed about or ashamed of. So this was a time when there was darkness. This was a time when God was working. I'm sure some people wondered if God's working at all, he must be working in a manner that is very, very hidden. I want to suggest to you that we're going through a similar phase at the moment, and thank God we can see more signs of God at work than perhaps the people of Zachariah and Elizabeth's day could see. But nevertheless, in the midst of all of this, God was about to do something, and God had been doing something. Because God was about to bring John the Baptist into the world, and then, of course, he was about to bring his son, Jesus, into the world. So how was God at work in this time? Well, we know the story of Zachariah. I would guess many of those who are watching today know the story of Zachariah and Elizabeth. How it didn't end at verse 7 that Zachariah was a priest, and that Zachariah went one day to the temple to burn incense as part of his priestly duty. And he has this encounter with an angel Gabriel, and the angel tells him that his wife Elizabeth is going to have a son, and that they're going to call him John, because he's God's gift. He's a gift from God, not just to them, but to the nation. And you will remember how Zachariah couldn't believe his ears, and because he questioned the angel says, "This will be your sign. You're not going to be able to talk until this child comes into the world." And then, of course, there's the story of how Elizabeth becomes pregnant, and eventually John the Baptist comes into the world, and Zachariah writes on a tablet that his name is to be called John. So it's a fascinating story. It's an amazing story of God's grace and power at a time of darkness. But before John the Baptist entered the world, and even before Elizabeth became pregnant, God was still at work, even though most people couldn't see it. And in fact, Zachariah and Elizabeth couldn't see it. They never anticipated what was going to happen. So how was God at work in the dark? Well, I think there are a number of ways in which God was working at this time when there seemed to be darkness all around. The first thing to say is this, that God had given words to his servants, the prophets, many, many hundreds of years before the events that we read about today took place. In Isaiah chapter 40, we have a scripture, a prophecy that John the Baptist applied to himself. It says, "The voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight paths for his feet." God had given a prophetic word to his people that was recorded in the scriptures. And that prophetic word still hadn't come to pass. It still hadn't been realized. Now, I'm sure there are some of us that are watching today, and God has spoken things over your life that still haven't come to pass. Just because they haven't come to pass, they haven't been realized in the time frame in which you expected them to be realized, it doesn't take away from the heart of God for you or the purpose and plan of God for your life. It hasn't changed just because it hasn't happened in the time frame that you expected. And then, of course, Zechariah and Elizabeth were praying people. Look at verse 13 for a moment when Zechariah has this encounter with the angel Gabriel. The angel says to him, he says, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard. Your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you are to call him John." Your prayer, Zechariah, has been heard. I think it's amazing sometimes that we pray prayers and we don't actually expect them to be answered. It reminds me of Acts chapter 12. Do you remember when Peter was in prison and the church is praying for Peter, and an angel comes into the prison where he is, and he jailbreaks him. He gets him out of prison. And Peter goes to Rhoda's house and he knocks on the door. Someone comes to the door and says it's Peter, and everyone reacts with, "Oh, it can't be Peter, it must be his angel." Here are the people who are praying that Peter will be released from prison, and yet when their prayers are answered, they can't believe that it's happened. Zechariah is one of those people who has prayed for something and he doesn't believe that the answer has come. If I were to say to you today, who believes in the power of prayer? I would guess most of us would say, yes, I believe in the power of prayer. But let me ask you another question. Do you believe in the power of your prayers? Do you believe in the power of what you have prayed? Because I think that's where we fall down sometimes. We're happy to believe that God can answer prayer and God can work through anyone's prayer. But when it actually comes down to our lives, we somehow think that there's some sort of deficiency in us or in our prayers, and that somehow perhaps God isn't just as attentive to our prayers as he is to the prayers of others. I want to encourage you today that God is as attentive to your prayers as he is to anyone else's. If you come to him in faith, if you come to him and pray earnestly and sincerely, he will hear your prayers. He might not answer in the time that you expect him to answer. He might not answer in the way that you expect him to answer, but he hears your prayers. A third way that God was working in the darkness is he's working in the darkness of Elizabeth's body. You know, she didn't realize what was going on. I'm sure she had got to the place where she thought this is never going to happen. And yet we find that she becomes pregnant. And 9 months later, John the Baptist comes into the world. God was at work in her body. God was at work in her body in such a way as to bring life where there was barrenness. This is a theme throughout the history of Israel. If you read the Old Testament scriptures and you read about Abraham and Sarah, Sarah was barren. Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac had to pray for his wife Rebekah so that she would bear children. And we find the same with Rachel, Jacob's wife Rachel. Jacob had to pray. They had to believe God for a breakthrough. Think of Hannah in 1 Samuel, just right at the beginning, the mother of Samuel. So there's this pattern that we see in Scripture where there's lifelessness and where there's barrenness and God bringing new life. Now, I don't know how that applies to you. I don't know if there's an area in your life that's barren and you think God can never work in that again. Let me tell you that He can. He can. He's able to bring life where there has been He's able to bring fruitfulness where there's been barrenness. He's able to bring life where there's been death. I mean, that's the whole Christian story, isn't it? That Jesus died and rose again. We are people of the resurrection. God was at work in Elizabeth's body. And God was also at work in the hiddenness of the encounter that Zachariah has with the angel Gabriel in the holy place. Just want you to think of it for a moment. He goes into the holy place. I don't know how well lit it was. There was the 7-branched candlestick there, and I guess that lit it up. But there's a degree of hiddenness. It's hidden from the world. There's a crowd outside. But Zachariah he's there burning the incense, and God meets with him. God still wants to meet with people in the hiddenness of the holy place. Those times when we go into our room, when we lock the door, and when we seek His face, we can meet with God. Thank God we don't need to go to any special place. We can meet with Him anywhere. And He wants to have, I was going to say FaceTime with us. He wants to have a close-up and personal encounter with us. God works in the hiddenness of the holy place. So God was at work, even though people couldn't see it. God was at work, even though people didn't recognize it. And I want to say today that God is at work in our lives, often in ways that we don't recognize, often in ways that we can't see. But just because we can't see it or we can't recognize it, it doesn't mean that He's not at work. And in this time of darkness in our nation, in this time of challenge in our churches, in this time of difficulty on a personal level and perhaps great disappointment on a personal level, God is still at work, even though we may not recognize it. So what do you do when you can't see what God's doing? Well, I want to give you some things that I hope will be of a help to you. I want us to just look at Zachariah and Elizabeth for a moment. And here are 3 things that I want to give you today. First of all, when it's dark and when you can't see what God's doing, stay devoted. Look at verse 6. Both of them were righteous in the sight of God, observing all the Lord's commands and decrees blamelessly. Stay devoted. Stay close to God. Second thing, do your duty. Keep serving. Keep doing what you do. Look what it says here in, where is it? Verses 8 and 9. Zachariah's division was on duty, and he was serving as priest before God. He was chosen by lot according to the custom of the priesthood to go into the temple of the Lord and burn incense. You know, because there were so many priests in Israel, this was something that you probably did once in your lifetime, or maybe twice in your lifetime. There were all sorts of other duties that the priests had, but this was a special one. This was the opportunity of a lifetime. I want to encourage you, friends, to keep doing what you do. Don't let your spiritual discipline slip. Don't Don't pull back on serving. Don't allow the pressures of the present time to draw you away from what's important. Third thing, verse 13, and I've mentioned it a moment ago, is don't underestimate the impact of your prayers. Don't underestimate the impact of your prayers. When Zechariah, verse 12, saw the angel Gabriel, he was startled and was gripped with fear. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah. Your prayer has been heard." I don't know, maybe some of us have become a little bit weary because we're thinking, I don't know if God's heard my prayers. I don't know if he'll ever answer them. I don't know if it makes any difference. I want to say to you, friends, it makes a difference. Potentially, Zachariah and Elizabeth had been praying for decades for a child. And now, prayer has been heard and it's going to be answered in the way that they had originally hoped. Don't doubt the impact of your prayers. This might be a time of difficulty. It might be a time of darkness. It might be a time when we find it hard to see the way that God's at work. But I want to encourage you, the future is beginning, and it's beginning in the darkness. And I pray that God will give us the eyes to see what he's doing at this time, and like Zachariah and Elizabeth, to cooperate with him and work with him as he brings about what's in his heart for us. God bless you, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you so much for that, James. A lot to think over. The latest COVID Christmas restrictions may have impacted you in a difficult way, and so I want to let you know that we at PCC are praying for you. We're praying that you have somebody to share the day with. We're praying that that your mental health is going to be okay. And we're praying that God will just bring you joy throughout this Christmas season, no matter where you are and where you're spending it. If you are struggling, please do reach out to us and let us know. We'd love to be able to do what we can to help you. Or maybe you have a spare slot for somebody in your Christmas bubble. Why not have a think about that and pray and see if there's somebody you know is going to be on their own, and invite them to join you in your Christmas bubble. Guys, it's been wonderful spending this time with you. Remember, we do have the Zoom call straight after the service this morning. And if you're going to be the live in-person service this afternoon, then we'll see you at OCR at 5 p.m. If you're not able to get there, then that's okay. Not a problem. We will see you on the 27th. We will be back here with an online service on the 27th. So we'll see you then.
See said it, yeah. If you said it, we believe it. Yeah, if you said it, we believe it. Yeah, if you said it. Oh.